Let's go even deeper. To truly understand how Americans spent their free time in the 1920s, we need to zoom in, not just on the big cities and famous figures, but on the everyday people, the ones history books sometimes forget. Because not everyone lived in New York or Chicago. Not everyone wore sequin dresses or smoked cigars in hidden clubs. Much of America, most of it in fact, was still rural, still traditional, but still changing. The rural experience. Narrator. Out on the farms, free time looked very different. After long days of tending crops or raising animals, rural families might relax on a front porch, play music together, or read aloud by lantern light. Homemade instruments were common: a fiddle, a harmonica, or a beat-up old piano handed down through generations. In many places, Saturday night meant community. Barn dances, church socials, county fairs. These weren't just about fun. They were a chance to see people, to laugh, to court, to trade stories under the stars. And even though prohibition laws existed in every county, well, let's just say homemade moonshine wasn't exactly rare in the countryside. The African American experience. Narrator. In African American communities, the 1920s were a time of cultural power and deep resilience. The Harlem Renaissance wasn't just about poetry and music. It was a form of joy in the face of adversity. Free time was often spent in music halls, on front stoops, in barbershops and salons, in churches and nightclubs, celebrating community, creativity, and survival. Langston Hughes wrote, Duke Ellington played, and ordinary Black families found their own joy in small gatherings, picnics, storytelling, and dance. Even in the Jim Crow South, where laws were brutal and unjust, people carved out spaces for rest and resistance. Leisure was an act of defiance and of hope. Women's changing leisure. Narrator. The 1920s marked a turning point for American women. With the passage of the 19th Amendment, women finally won the right to vote. But freedom wasn't just political, it was personal. For the first time, women were showing up in spaces previously dominated by men, in sports, in the workplace, and yes, in leisure. Young women, especially flappers, embraced bold fashion, shorter hairstyles, and nights out on the town. But leisure wasn't just about rebellion. Many women joined social clubs, literary societies, and civic organizations. They volunteered. They organized. They painted. They taught. They led. This was the first generation of women who expected and demanded a life outside of the home. Children and teens in the 20s. Narrator. What about kids? With labor laws beginning to improve, fewer children were working full-time. That meant more time for school and for play. Boys played baseball in the streets, girls jumped rope or played hopscotch. Radio shows for children were becoming popular. So were comic strips in the newspaper. Early versions of what would become comic books just a decade later. Board games like Mahjong became trendy. So did jigsaw puzzles and dominoes. Teenagers for the first time began developing a culture of their own. Music, fashion, slang, it all began to separate the youth from the generations before them. The word teenager hadn't even been invented yet. But the attitude? It was already alive and kicking. Technology and gadgets as leisure. Narrator. Technology was becoming a part of play. Record players let people listen to their favorite songs at home. Cameras, especially Kodak's Brownie, let everyday folks capture memories. People were fascinated by machines, by gadgets, by the marvels of electricity. Radio kits became popular for hobbyists. Some people even built their own antennas, trying to pull in distant stations from across the country. The 1920s were full of wonder, a sense that anything was possible. and that excitement carried into how people chose to spend their time. Immigrant communities. Narrator. Across America, immigrant communities brought their own leisure traditions. In Italian neighborhoods, families gathered for loud meals, music, and Sunday walks. In Jewish communities, Yiddish theater thrived alongside debates in cafes and community centers. In Irish bars, Polish halls, and German beer gardens, dances and festivals kept heritage alive. Leisure wasn't just about fun, it was about identity. It was a way to hold on to culture in a new land. Despite facing discrimination, many immigrant families created vibrant, self-sustaining communities where art, faith, food, and laughter were shared freely. Nature and travel. Narrator. National parks became increasingly popular in the 1920s. Thanks to the car, families can now get out of town and see the great outdoors. Camping, fishing, and hiking gained momentum. For those who could afford it, resorts in places like the Catskills or along the coast offered weekend getaways. And then there was the beach. Photos from the 1920s show bathing suits getting bolder and crowds flocking to the shore. Sunbathing became a thing. Even tanning became stylish instead of being seen as a sign of outdoor labor. It was freedom in a new form, one that combined fashion, nature, and social mingling. Religion and reflection. Narrator. Not all free time was spent dancing or driving. For many Americans, especially in rural areas, faith remains central. Church on Sunday wasn't just a service. It was a social hub, a day of rest, a place to sing, to talk, to be seen. Prayer meetings, potlucks, and gospel sings filled Sunday afternoons. For many, leisure was spiritual. It wasn't about escape. It was about connection. Final reflection, wrapping up the era. Narrator. By the end of the 1920s, the world was about to change. In 1929, the stock market crashed, plunging America into the Great Depression. Many of the luxuries and pleasures of the decade would vanish overnight. But for a brief, brilliant moment, the 1920s were electric. A dance across the edge of modern life, a celebration of movement, sound, freedom, and change. The way Americans spent their time, what they valued, how they connected, how they unwound would echo into every generation that followed. So when you laugh at a movie, or drive just for fun, or listen to music that moves your soul, you're not just enjoying the moment. You're reliving a piece of the Roaring '20s, the decade when free time became truly free. Thank you for spending this time with us. If you enjoyed this longer dive into everyday life in the 1920s, we invite you to subscribe and explore even more untold stories of the past. Drop a comment below. Tell us which decade or topic you'd like us to explore next. Until next time, stay curious and keep history alive. So, what can we learn from how Americans spent their free time in the 1920s? That even in a time of massive change, new machines, new freedoms, and a world recovering from war, people always found ways to enjoy life. They danced through their fears. They laughed through their radios. They connected in movie theaters, clubs, ballparks, and backyards. And in doing so, they shaped a century of culture that followed. Whether it was a spontaneous Charleston in a jazz hall or a quiet evening listening to a crackling radio in a candlelit room, leisure wasn't just about escape. It was about expression. And it still is. 100 years later, we scroll instead of swing dance. We stream instead of tune in. But the heart of free time, it's the same. We're still searching for joy, connection, and a little rhythm in our routine. So, next time you take a break, throw on a song or settle into your favorite show, tip your hat to the 1920s because they were the first to show us what it really means to live a little. How Americans really spent their free time in the Roaring Twenties. When you hear the words Roaring Twenties, what pops into your mind? Flappers, bootleggers, Gatsby-esque parties filled with glitter and champagne. Sure, those things existed, but for most Americans, daily life wasn't all glitz and glamour. It was simpler, more grounded, and in many ways, more fascinating. Let's step away from the movie scenes and dive into how people in the 1920s really spent their free time. The 1920s was the first decade where Americans truly began to experience leisure as we know it today. For the first time, thanks to shorter work hours, higher wages, and new technologies, people actually had time and a growing number of ways to enjoy it. And enjoy it they did. One of the biggest revolutions in entertainment came through music and dancing. Jazz exploded out of New Orleans and swept the nation. The Charleston, the shimmy, and the Lindy Hop took over dance halls from New York to Chicago. People weren't just listening, they were moving. Night after night, men in suits and women in beaded dresses filled crowded clubs to let go of their worries and dance to the sound of freedom. And that freedom, it had a soundtrack. Jazz was bold, improvisational, unpredictable, and to many older Americans, even scandalous. But to the youth, it was everything. It wasn't just music. It was rebellion, expression, energy. It was the voice of a generation shaking off the stiffness of the past. But when Americans weren't dancing the night away, they were filling up movie theaters in record numbers. The silent film era was in full swing. Stars like Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, and Clara Bow weren't just actors. They were household names. Moviegoing became a national pastime. For just a few cents, families could escape into stories of romance, adventure, or comedy. It was affordable, accessible, and, for many, magical. By the end of the decade, movies had begun to talk. The arrival of sound and film, the famous talkies, changed everything. It was one more step toward a future of modern entertainment. But the biggest shift of all, it was happening in living rooms across America, thanks to the radio. The radio wasn't just a device. It was a portal. For the first time in history, people across the country could hear the same song, the same voice, the same baseball game, at the same time. It brought people together in ways they'd never imagined. Families would gather around the radio to hear jazz concerts, comedy shows, dramatic plays, and breaking news. It was exciting. It was intimate. It was the internet of its time, without the buffering. And then there were sports. If you think Americans are obsessed with sports now, the 1920s planted that seed. Babe Ruth dominated baseball. His home runs weren't just hits, they were events. Stadiums packed out with roaring fans. Boxing, college football, and even tennis were becoming national sensations. People didn't just watch sports, they played them too. Free time meant more outdoor fun. Neighborhood games, Sunday picnics, swimming in lakes and rivers, even roller skating. The average American was getting out and getting active. And how did they get there? That's where the automobile comes in. The car wasn't just a machine. It was a symbol of freedom. Thanks to mass production, especially by Henry Ford, cars became affordable to the middle class. Suddenly, people could explore. They took weekend drives, visited family, or just cruised country roads for the sheer joy of it. For young people, cars meant privacy, something previous generations never had. And let's just say, they made full use of it. But it wasn't always loud and fast. Some leisure was slow and thoughtful. Reading, writing letters, joining book clubs, collecting stamps, or taking up sewing were just as popular. Magazines were booming. Ladies' Home Journal, Good Housekeeping, the Saturday Evening Post, these were staples in American homes. Especially women were finding new spaces for independence. With the right to vote finally secured, many joined clubs, supported causes, or simply explored interests that had been off limits before. Of course, we can't talk about the 1920s without mentioning the forbidden fun: alcohol. During Prohibition, alcohol was banned, but that didn't stop people, not even close. Speakeasies, secret bars hidden behind unmarked doors, inside basements, or disguised as businesses became the social centers of the decade. You'd need a password, a friend in the know, or a little luck to get in. Inside, live jazz, dim lights, illegal cocktails, and a whole lot of dancing. It was underground, exciting, and rebellious. But not everyone was partying. For many Americans, free time was still precious and simple. Maybe a Sunday dinner, a stroll with the family, or time spent tending a garden. You see, the Roaring Twenties wasn't just about one kind of person or one kind of life. It was the beginning of modern American leisure, full of contradictions in color, fast and slow, loud and quiet, glamorous and grounded. From jazz clubs to movie houses, radio shows to roller skates, road trips to radio broadcasts, the 1920s were when Americans learned how to live beyond just work. They learned how to relax, to laugh, to express, and to play. And in doing so, they shaped the culture we still know today. So the next time you're at the movies, listening to music, dancing like nobody's watching, just remember, you're carrying on a legacy nearly 100 years in the making. The Roaring Twenties never really ended. To truly understand how people in the 1920s relaxed, we need to ask one more question. What did celebration mean in an era that had just survived a world war and a deadly flu pandemic? Because when the 1920s began, the world had just emerged from darkness. World War I had ended. The Spanish flu had killed millions. And after so much grief, so much sacrifice, people wanted to feel alive again. And so they celebrated. Holidays and public celebrations. Major holidays were big, just in a different way. 4th of July meant fireworks, parades, and community baseball games. Thanksgiving meant enormous home-cooked meals and neighborhood gatherings. Christmas was more modest than today, but full of carols, handmade gifts, and candlelit trees. Labor Day and Memorial Day were marked with processions, speeches, and picnics. Small towns held carnivals, fairs, and local festivals that brought entire counties together. It wasn't just about the holiday itself. It was about gathering, sharing time, and feeling part of something bigger. Leisure in the home. Narrator. Let's go indoors again, to the home. The average American home in the 1920s was modest. Apartments in cities, farmhouses in the country. No air conditioning, often just one radio, a single bathroom if you had one at all. But home was also where many people found peace. Evenings were often spent in conversation, reading a book aloud, listening to a serial on the radio, playing cards or checkers on the kitchen table. People hosted more often, too. Friends came over for coffee, couples entertained neighbors with dinner and dancing. In many homes, there were fewer possessions, but more time. And that time was often spent together. Fashion as leisure expression. Narrator. Now let's talk about what people wore, because fashion was a form of leisure. In the 1920s, fashion became faster, freer, and bolder. For women, hemlines rose, corsets loosened, and short haircuts like the bob became stylish. Beaded dresses, bold lipstick, and smoky eyes weren't just looks, they were statements. For men, baggy suits, fedoras, and polished shoes ruled the streets. The double-breasted look, two-tone shoes, and even pinstripes were popular, especially for city nightlife. Clothing became fun, expressive, and often theatrical, especially in leisure time. Even bathing suits were evolving. Men and women both began showing more skin at the beach, sparking debates about modesty and freedom. Hidden subcultures and queer nightlife. And under the surface, away from the headlines, other communities found their joy. In places like New York's Greenwich Village and parts of Chicago, LGBTQ+ individuals carved out hidden spaces. Speakeasies, drag balls, and underground cabarets offered sanctuary for self-expression. These weren't always safe, but they were sacred. Leisure became a lifeline, a rare moment to be oneself. Historians now recognize that some of the earliest queer nightlife culture in the U.S. took shape during this very decade. It wasn't just celebration. It was survival. Books, libraries, and the rise of reading culture. Public libraries were growing fast in the 1920s. Thanks to the Carnegie Library movement and increased literacy, books became central to everyday leisure. Mystery novels, romantic serials, and scientific journals alike were available for the curious mind. Book clubs were especially popular among women, offering both reading and social connection. And for immigrant families, libraries were often the first step to learning English and integrating into the culture. Quiet time with a book? It was one of the most powerful private luxuries of the decade. Leisure around the world. Of course, America wasn't alone. Let's look outward for a moment. In Paris, the cafes buzzed with poets, painters, and jazz musicians. In Berlin, nightlife was explosive, full of cabaret, film, and experimental music. In Tokyo, Western fashion and dance crazes mingled with traditional tea houses and theaters. Across the globe, the 1920s were years of cultural fusion, youthful energy, and transformation. It was the first truly modern decade, connected by ships, trains, telegrams, and radio waves. And wherever you went, people were trying to balance the old and the new, tradition and rebellion, order and release. Americans and escapism. Back in the U.S., escapism was everywhere. People didn't just want fun, they wanted distraction from war, from trauma, from poverty. That's why cinema became so magical, why jazz sounded so alive, why even small pleasures like a game of bridge or a simple road trip felt like freedom. In leisure, Americans found a sense of control, a pocket of time where they could write their own story, if only for an afternoon. Final reflections. The Roaring Twenties were never just about roaring. They were about rebirth, about reckoning, about the first taste of a future people weren't quite ready for, but couldn't wait to chase. The way people spent their free time in that decade shaped everything that came after. Modern dating, music culture, fashion as freedom, technology as play, mass media as connection. Thank you for taking this journey with us, not just through the parties and parades, but through the porches, the picnics, the pages of a forgotten book. History isn't only made in headlines. Sometimes it's made on a Sunday afternoon, with the radio playing, a breeze in the curtains, and nothing to do but be alive. If you've enjoyed this story, consider liking the video, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who loves a good walk through time. And in the comments, tell us, what does your free time look like today? And how does it compare to 100 years ago? Until next time, stay curious, stay kind, and keep history breathing. As the decade roared on, something else emerged. Not just fun, not just fashion, but a new kind of fame. The 1920s gave birth to something we now live with every single day: celebrity culture, the rise of the American icon. Before Instagram, before reality shows, there was the silver screen. Movie stars like Rudolph Valentino, Clara Bow, and Douglas Fairbanks weren't just actors. They were idols. Their hairstyles, clothing, even the way they walked, people copied them. For the first time, average Americans were shaping their free time around fame, buying movie magazines, attending fan clubs, even adjusting their style to match Hollywood trends. Athletes, too, became national icons. Babe Ruth wasn't just a baseball player. He was a walking dream, a symbol of power, rebellion, and success. This was the beginning of something profound, a culture where leisure wasn't just about doing, it was about watching. And who you watched mattered. Advertising and consumer leisure. Of course, where attention goes, money follows. And in the 1920s, advertising exploded. Billboards, radio jingles, glossy magazine spreads. Companies were no longer just selling products, they were selling lifestyles. Want to be modern? Buy this Ford. Want to be desirable? Use this soap. Want to be fun? Drink this soda, wear this dress, listen to this record. Leisure was no longer just a reward, it was a market. And every moment of your free time, someone was trying to monetize it. Progress versus tradition. But not everyone was cheering for change. Across the country, a quiet battle was unfolding between the past and the future. Religious leaders warned about the dangers of jazz, short skirts, and loose living. Small towns clung to old customs even as cities embraced chaos. Prohibition wasn't just a legal policy, it was a moral stand, a belief that leisure had become too indulgent, too sinful, too fast. And beneath it all was a deep anxiety. What happens when people enjoy too much freedom? Would they stop working hard? Would they forget their roots? The 1920s weren't just about expression. They were about negotiating identity in a changing world. Segregation and unequal leisure. Narrator, somber tone. But while some Americans danced freely, others were still excluded. In the Jim Crow South and in much of the North, too, Black Americans face strict segregation in public spaces. Separate swimming pools, separate restaurants, separate theaters. Often, leisure for Black communities meant creating entirely separate institutions, from music halls to boarding houses to traveling carnivals. It was a parallel world, rich in culture but shaped by injustice. But even in that divide, joy thrived. Music soared, community held firm, and leisure, in all its forms, became an act of resistance. The psychology of the Jazz Age. So, what was really going on beneath the parties, the fashion, the road trips? Why was everyone chasing pleasure? Psychologists and writers of the time began to explore something new, that perhaps this joy was covering up something. A lost generation, veterans haunted by trench warfare, young people who had seen the world almost end twice. And now they danced, they drank, they laughed hard, not because they were careless, but because they cared so deeply about life, about living, about squeezing every drop of meaning out of the days they were given. Leisure became a kind of therapy, a balm, a rebellion, a way to say, we are still here. Toward the crash. But the good times weren't built to last. By 1929, the warning signs were clear. Debt was piling up, stocks were overvalued, wages were stagnating. And when the crash came, suddenly, brutally, it shattered the illusion. Millions lost their jobs, their homes, their hope. The parties stopped, the jazz quieted, and leisure became a distant memory. But the ideas, the habits, the dreams, they didn't disappear. They went underground. They waited. And in the decades to come, they'd rise again in new forms, in new ways, shaping American life for the rest of the 20th century. Narrator, reflective. So when we ask, how did people spend their free time in the Roaring '20s? The real answer is simple. They lived. Fully, fiercely, beautifully. In parlors and speakeasies, in ballparks and libraries, on city streets and country porches. They laughed because they'd cried. They danced because they'd crawled. They played because they'd earned it. And in that space between work and worry, they discovered something powerful. That even a single hour of joy can carry a generation through anything. Narrator, warm. Thank you for walking this hour with us through the rhythms, rituals, and quiet revolutions of the 1920s. If this story moved you, please like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves history with heart. And in the comments below, tell us, how do you spend your free time? And what do you think the 2120s will say about us? Until then, stay curious, stay kind, and never forget. History is not just what happened. It's what we choose to remember.